Anti-Vaxxers of Reddit. What turned you against vaccines? And then what convinced you that they were necessary? My cousin is an ex-anti-vaxxer. He and his wife lost a child to a disease we vaccinate for. He divorced her after she refused to vaccinate their other 2 children and 1 custody. He has come to terms with the loss and blames the fundamentalist religious sect they were in with the death. He converted. She was raised that way. He thought she had the kids in for checkups and everything. Thought God would protect them from disease. He now believes God gives him the tools, like medicine and vaccines, to protect his kids. OMG, this is heartbreaking. I was vaccinated as a child, but my mother began making comments when I was in about middle school that she regretted it, and if she could do it over again, she wouldn't have vaxxed me or my sister. Nothing was wrong with either of us, but she felt it was a risk, given the apparent connection between vaccines and autism, according to whatever she read. Like most kids, my mother's opinion almost instantly became my own, and I maintained that opinion for years. However, I never did any independent research of my own because I wasn't having kids, so I didn't find it particularly relevant or interesting. I still don't have kids, but as the topic of vaccines became more widely discussed and my friends began having children and facing the decision themselves, I chose to become more educated on the topic, and I am thoroughly convinced they are absolutely necessary, and my mother was obviously misinformed big time. I honestly hate to even admit I was ever on the other side of that argument. Even if vaccines caused autism, I'd rather have my child become autistic than die. In circa 1949, my father and my mother, who was pregnant with my sister, hosted a couple for dinner. A few weeks later they found out their lady friend had polio. They wiped just about every square inch of the house with bleach to sterilize it. Imagine the dread. I was anti-vaccinations for unnecessary things. Things that weren't lethal in a healthy person. Flu, chickenpox. Yes, it can kill some people, but not most, and the risk isn't worth it. But then I actually researched it. I also had a baby. I am not letting my baby freaking die because of a risk of whatever the frick. Originally, cause my mom was anti-vax. I was anti-vax until I was sometime around 15/16. Then I did some research after lots of Reddit posts. Maybe it was the fact I was young and more open-minded that changed my mind, but glad I did. Sorry if that's boring, but it is what it is. I had to ask my doctor if we could talk in private. My over-religious mother wasn't going to have it. Took 3 doctors to explain to her about doctor-patient confidentiality. When she walked out of the room, she looked at me going, "You better not do anything without me permission." When my doctor and I talked, I told her I wasn't vaccinated. Took 4 painful shots that day. Went in a few months later to get them. That was one of the first times I realized my mother was insane. I distinctly remember a conversation with another kid in the 5th grade about how dangerous we thought vaccines were because both of our parents fed us their rhetoric. A few years I realized I was the only person I knew my own age who'd had chickenpox, and it was because all of my classmates were vaccinated and I wasn't. Chickenpox was pretty miserable. I realized I was missing other vaccines too, and started doing some googling. The arguments I read against vaccines just didn't make sense, and I didn't like the argument that a parent's job is to protect their own child from any potential harm from vaccines, no matter how small, to the detriment of other people. I guess the attitude of the anti-vax community played a part in it. I was non-hardcore anti-vaxxer when it came to seasonal vaccines, like the flu shot, but never more serious preventative shots. My odd logic was something like, I want to be exposed to the full strength strain so I have a better immune system. That changed when I took an optional survey at my college that had questions which were phrased in a way that provided information on the topic. It was the first time I really got to thinking about herd immunity, and maybe there's not just myself to think about. The permanence of willful ignorance some people have about vaccines in general drives me crazy now, so I cringe a little when I think about how anti-flu shot I used to be. I worked in retail. I get a flu crap every year because humans are filthy disease-carrying germ bombs on legs. We were young and naive. I was 20 and she was 21. We grew up in a super conservative church. All the parents in the church seemed to think that it was a horrible idea to pump your kids full of drugs just hours after birth. They'd give crazy stats about Japanese did studies and instances of SIDS dropped by over 80% when they waited until after 5 to vaccinate, and the autism scares. She also had family that was convinced it was a horrible idea. My kids are now 10, 12, 13 and vaccinated. I would say that actual research turned us against it. Sad to say, but we spent so much time concerned about what our peers would think of us. It's terrifying to think now about the tragedy that could have happened because of our ignorance. Looking back, we know we were fools and just thankful that our kids are now healthy. I always found the "but it causes autism" argument weird. Even if it were true, which it isn't. I'd rather my child have autism than a headstone. I have a brother with high functioning autism and bipolar. He started showing signs of autism at 2, maybe younger, but my parents didn't realize something was wrong until he was 4. I think my parents felt guilty for my brother being ruined forever, so they latched onto a conspiracy theory to ease their pain. They had a few books about it that, to 12-year-old me, seemed legit at explaining that vaccines can give kids mercury poisoning, which somehow turns into autism. I genuinely believed this until I was like 17 and started seeing social media posts with good sources explaining why everything about the vaccines conspiracy was wrong. I've tried to convince my parents by showing them articles and videos explaining why the original doctor had an incentive to give the MMR shot a bad rep. And I've also asked them why autism is worse than death, but they're both too in denial to accept the truth. The irony with all that is I had anti-Vaxxer parents and I turned up on the autism spectrum regardless. Also, screw your parents for thinking your brother is ruined. I wasn't actually an anti-Vaxxer, but preparing for the birth of my first child, I decided that I wanted to do an alternative schedule for vaccination. I had heard a lot about how the vaccination schedule was much more intensive than when I was growing up, and was concerned that we didn't have 20 years of studies on how multiple early exposures affected people as they aged. Luckily, the pediatrician I had chosen was open to alternative scheduling, opening the door for dialogue, but insisted that kids be up to date by age 2, closing the door on non-vaccinated kids in practice. She talked with me about the new schedule and I realized that it was so intensive compared to my own childhood immunization schedule because new vaccines had been developed that saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of children every year. You can vaccinate against certain types of bacterial infection now, and that blows my freaking mind. I ended up using the recommended schedule for both my kids. The risk of adverse vaccine reaction pales in comparison to the risk of preventable disease complications. My eldest child had one of those rare serious reactions. You know how you are supposed to stay back 20 minutes or so just in case? Well, worth it, as I'm sure things would have been a lot worse without instant medical attention. I didn't vaccinate my next 2 children because I was so afraid the same would happen and they'd die. The ped we saw about the reaction suggested we think about not vaccinating. But then every cough or rash I start worrying, is this whooping cough? Could I have prevented this? What if? Fortunately, I've got 3 otherwise healthy children and they've not had any major issues. The younger 2 are still completely vax free, but the middle one is almost old enough that we will go ahead on an adjusted schedule. I guess I was pro-vax, fear-based anti-vax, and now coming into pro-vax territory again. This is actually a reasonable stance. Some people have adverse reactions. I wouldn't fault you for being afraid of your children having adverse reactions, considering one did. Your kids are the reason why people should vaccinate. I used to listen to a guy's podcast that was mostly about mixed bag survival stuff, economics, hunting, politics, etc. Well, he seemed to know a lot about those topics, but then he started to talk about vaccination and how bad it is etc, especially for seasonal disease like the flu. He went all conspiracy idiot over the swine flu scare a few years ago. Anyways, I kinda stopped listening, had kids, my wife got them vaccinated, she's a nurse. I was still kind of on the fence. Then one day, this guy posted a meme against vaccines. A woman replied with facts pro-vaccines. I agreed with the lady, and he lost his mind at both of us. At that point I just told him his reaction to facts was completely irrational, and stopped following him on any social media. No use dealing with that kind of toxicity. I just thank God my wife is smart, cause I'm not. I am not an anti-vaxxer, but one of my cousins is. She is in the camp that believe vaccines cause autism. Her almost 4-year-old daughter was recently diagnosed as on the spectrum, yet she still refuses to get her daughter's vaccines. Some people are just so dumb. Just to say, my mom literally almost died from the measles when she was 6 or 7. Any disease that vaccines protect against could kill a child. Please do your research and make the right choice. Vaccinate your children. I am super late to the conversation, but I want to add my experience in case it matters helps. My ex-husband is a strong anti-vaxxer. He takes it to extremes, and this is one of the many reasons why we are no longer together. When our daughter got her MMR vaccine, she's 9 now, she stopped talking completely. She was developing rapidly and just stopped talking. We were both fairly convinced it was the vaccine, but I personally kept quiet about other possibilities because he was mentally and emotionally abusive to me. My daughter was in speech therapy for over a year before she got back on track, but my ex was still fairly convinced she was developing traits on the autism spectrum. She's fine, smartest in her class and very social. When we separated and the kids stayed with me, one of the things that struck me was that schools don't like to deal with your unvaccinated kids. Not only that, but other parents don't want to deal with them. This was something my ex never had to deal with, and as our 2 children got older, I started to realize that they were going to be in for a rough time for so many reasons. So, without his permission, I took them and got them caught up on everything. This wasn't easy to do because their insurance was through him. I told him immediately, and I still deal with the bullying and bulls constantly. Anytime they do poorly in school, it's my fault. Our son makes the honor roll every turn, but he could do better if it weren't for vaccines. Every time they get sick, it's my fault. He throws at my face constantly that if they ever die, it is going to be my fault. Here's the thing. Sometimes we don't vaccinate because we're in an abusive, controlling relationship with the other parent. I know I can't be the only one out there who has had to deal with this. I promise you that not allowing your child to be vaccinated goes hand in hand with this abuse that your spouse is dishing out to you. I struggled so much with doing this behind his back, but I would do it even sooner if I could do it again. You make up the other half of your child's protection, and if this is something you are for and your spouse is against, I would strongly advise you to reevaluate your relationship. Aside from the abuse I've endured that isn't at all parenting related, I know we would have never made it simply on the grounds of how drastically different our parenting ideas are. It is amazing to me that whooping cough, pertussis, is no longer nearly extinct in the US. In fact, I had a booster because of this revelation. Can diphtheria be far behind? I don't want to think that many people are just plain stupid, but then when I look at current events, I am beginning to question my assumptions. I am not an anti-vaxxer, but I grew up as one. My twin brother has severe autism. He was diagnosed in the late 90s, when there was not nearly as much information or research about the disorder. My brother and I had been developing at the same rate, but suddenly when we turned 2, he changed drastically. He lost all his language. He couldn't make eye contact anymore, and he was completely disengaged. My parents were grieving as they watched my brother, who had previously been talking and walking before me, downward spiral. They were searching for answers at a time when nobody seemed to know what was going on. My brother was having meltdowns all the time, and my parents didn't know how to help. Enter Andrew Wakefield. Autism parents celebrated him as a hero because he seemed to be one of the only people trying to solve the mystery. If he could find the roots of autism, then there was hope for children to recover. Of course, recovery is a myth, but again, there was not a lot of knowledge about autism at the time. Growing up, I couldn't believe that people got vaccinated. I had always heard that they were dangerous, and I somehow was able to avoid mine. But then my parents started having doubts about Wakefield and the vaccine autism connection. Long story short, they do not believe in that association anymore. When we reflect on it now, we realize that the anti-vaxxer past had been riddled with confusion, strong emotion, and false hope. Today we see this vaccine issue as very grey, not the black and white one that the media promotes. When you take autism out of the picture, which should happen since it is not connected, vaccine injury is still a legitimate concern. For instance, many women became sick after reactions to Gardasil. Does this mean we shouldn't vaccinate? No, but we should aim for the highest standard of safety as possible. Also, it is our duty to make sure people are educated about what they are putting into their bodies. There's no studies who have shown that Gardasil has those side effects that people report. It's still only based on personal reports. My mother thinks that vaccines cause cancer and poison people. I was vaccinated at birth, before she thought all this. It was more of being taught to be against them from parents who knew nothing about the science of vaccines. The info they gave me wasn't true, especially on what's in the composition of vaccines. What convinced me was reading on how they work and understanding I should listen to those who have had training and have spent years of studying rather than listen to someone who has no degree and got their info from an article on Facebook. This won't ever be seen, but I didn't really care about vaccinations and what was going on with them until I enrolled in a veterinary technician program. My parents had me vaccinated fully. BTW. I have one word for you: rabies. Rabies is a zoonotic disease, which means both animals and humans can have it. Rabies is an awful virus that gets into your bloodstream and then attacks your central nervous system. It attacks your motherfucking brain, you guys. I don't know about you guys, but I rather like having my brain being my brain. People joke about the zombie apocalypse. Rabies is essentially the zombie virus. It literally turns you into one of two things: a viscous predator out for brains, or a dumb slow zombie who is also out for brains. Rabies can be vaccinated against, in both animals and people. The survival rate of an animal who has it is 0. Absolute 0. Why? You have to decapitate them and send in their head to have their brain tested for rabies. Yep, think about that for a second. Defenseless animals being euthanized and then decapitated to test for preventable disease. Rabies is so scary that there is a federal law that dogs must be vaccinated for it. You guys, a federal goddamn law. So yeah. Also, I've seen puppies with parvo and it's an awful disease. It's the #1 disease that kills puppies. Vaccinate yourselves. Vaccinate your pets. Vaccinate. Do it. Prevent deaths. Please scroll up and have a chat with you, Hillary 1111. My sister is a militant anti-vaxxer, and she's been poisoning our family with her Google pseudoscience garbage for the last 20 years. So when my girlfriend got pregnant 9+ years ago, I was a bit skeptical of vaccines. I read my sister's required reading and all that other garbage. Then I sat down with our pediatrician and had an intelligent conversation about the pros and cons of vaccinations. I knew it was pretty garbage before that conversation, but after I was convinced. Since then, I've become militant pro-vaccinations. I've threatened to sue my own sister if she knowingly brings her sick kids around mine and have severely limited their interactions. 300 million people died in the 20th century due to smallpox. When the smallpox vaccine came out, that number by say the late 1970s was 0. Smallpox that killed billions throughout the centuries is no more because of vaccination. Other diseases deaths like measles should be down say 100 a year worldwide. But sadly 135,000 in 2015 died, and now that number is going to go up because of stupid anti-vaxxers. I'm pretty sure there was a smallpox immunization before that, but I would imagine it got more widespread with time. Not me, but my dad. When the flawed research article that started the whole thing came out, he heard about it on the news and bought it for a little while. I remember him having to sign a waiver for some immunizations I needed for school. Fortunately, he is a well-informed guy, so it didn't last long before he realized how stupid it all was. My siblings and I survived to young adulthood with all of our important immunizations, though maybe a little late on a couple of them, and nobody has autism. I was concerned and suspicious about vaccines. I couldn't find any studies that proved them safe, and when I asked doctors for information they would aggressively say, well, do you want your children to die? I thought that was suspicious as heck. So I only had my kid vaccinated for a few selected diseases, not everything on the Australian vaccination plan. So a few years go by, and one year the flu shots cause some bad reactions, maybe even a death, in young children, and the Western Australian Health Department immediately shut down that year's flu vaccination due to safety concerns. That decided me. I hadn't really trusted the health establishment before, but if they were willing to swiftly and publicly shut down a program that looked harmful, then they had proved themselves trustworthy. I put my kid on a catch-up program for their vaccines after that. P's I still think that giving a 2-hour-old newborn baby a hepatitis B vaccine is not great. The thought of having a child with autism was so horrible that I realized I'd rather let my child die of a horrible virus than have to take care of it for the rest of my life. I was raised by parents who operate almost strictly on emotion. I was taught that fear should be the deciding factor instead of logic facts. It was a huge part of their religious beliefs and bled into every other area of their lives. My mum especially believes everything she hears if it is fueled by sensationalistic fear. I always believed what my parents did until I went to college, against their advice. I needed vaccines to attend and I had zero. You heard me right, never one vaccine in my entire life. We were homeschooled and never went to the doctor. I did some research on the vaccines I needed and was really surprised. I found multiple studies, papers, books, and logic thrown in on the pro-vaccine side. I found only vague, sensational, contradictory and just plain embarrassing information on the anti-vax side. I got caught up on my vaccines. So many here that grew up with parents who were anti-vaxxers. However, in my case it was my mother who beat some sense into me. Metaphorically, I was against vaccines for a brief time in my teens. I am and have always been very skeptical of many things, and around the first swine flu outbreak a couple of years ago I was in my teens. Practically everyone in my school took the vaccine, but I didn't. At the time the swine flu hadn't reached our country, and I thought that the overreaction was a bit unproportional, since only a handful of people had actually died from it, and there were also talk of it causing narcolepsy in some people. This made me very cautious and I decided not to take it. For a while after, like probably a few weeks, but it felt like longer, I was skeptical against vaccinations and I was thinking about it a lot. One day, I brought it up with my mother, my concerns about the narcolepsy and it being an overreaction, and she told me to snap out of it, that vaccine saves hundreds of lives, and told me of all the old diseases that used to kill tens of thousands, but that now extinct. And I realized that the reason why the swine flu was probably so hyped was because it had the potential to become very damaging. I regretted not getting the vaccine back then, but I sure as heck will in the future, especially after learning more about how they work and how the old diseases and such. Thanks, Mom. Former anti-vax parent here. Our first baby had a reaction to her first MMR shot. Scared me to death. Then we stopped vaccinating. Full stop. Our second child was taken to the legal, obligatory 2-week checkup. Then we didn't take her back. We moved to a larger city. I started getting news reports of the whooping cough outbreaks in our hometown. Measles and rubella were popping up, too. We found a new pediatrician, but in our new area, they wouldn't take kids who weren't vaccinated. Now, as any anti-vaxxer out there, I had done my research. I wrote my former self, and was convinced that no doctor would be able to dissuade me, but I asked some questions. The pediatrician treated me horribly. Even though I've changed my opinion to one more fact-based, I still think she would have gotten further with me had she been at least courteous. We changed pediatricians. Again, new pediatrician won't take kids that are not vaccinated. I, tired of this, bluntly asked why not. She said, I'll remember this for a long time, because I have kids that step into this office that have had more struggles with health in their young lives than anyone should ever experience. I'm not having kids in here that could very possibly kill them. I made an appointment with her to hear more of her side of it. Kids are all caught up now. Our third baby got all of his on time, on schedule. It's bigger than just us, guys. My middle child just got her MMR booster. Her poor little arm is swollen and red. Her doctor suggested Benadryl and Motrin, along with ice packs, popsicles, and snuggle time. She wrote out a prescription for just that. She's gonna be fine. Good luck finding an anti-vaxxer on Reddit. They probably have a hard time figuring out how to turn the computer on, let alone surf the net. A little off subject, but are anti-vaxxers largely an American thing? I've never heard of something so retarded here in Europe. They're spreading. My brother is an anti-vax moron and we're in the UK. My mother raised us to be against vaccinations. She always claimed that they either did not work or would make you sick. I spent the first 20-something years of my life that way. Then, when I wanted to enroll in a 4-year university, I had to get all of the shots most people get as children. The overwhelming scientific evidence turned me around. However, I was still very nervous when I went to get my shots, and I found that they hurt like a bee. The first time I ever heard my dad swear, he was watching the news whilst me and my little brother were playing in the corner. It was when the original theory came that vaccines were linked to autism. My brother and I were both vaccinated by this point. He proclaimed very loudly, "What the frick is this balls? I've never heard of anything so fricking stupid in my life." Then he remembered we were in the room, laughed, said he was sorry and gave us hugs. Kinda off topic, I know, but it's a memory that stick with me for 20 something years. I was never an anti-vaxxer, but members of my family have been. My youngest brother was about 3 years old, and after he was given the MMR vaccine he became ill in the evening, developed a fever and a few other symptoms, and gradually deteriorated over the next few weeks. The physical symptoms subsided, but his speech never properly returned and he became very withdrawn and agitated, and by the age of 4 or 5 he was diagnosed as severely autistic. He's 23 now and living in a supervised care environment with at least 2 dedicated carers looking after him 24 hours a day. I believe the timing of the MMR and the decline in his health was coincidental, but I can see how a parent would link the two and become very wary of exposing other children to the same risk. It's why a lot of the comments on here against anti-vaxxers don't sit right with me. Some people seem to assume that all people who are against vaccinations are clueless, ignorant conspiracy theorists. But the reality is that many people have reached the conclusion after suffering through years of heck and seeing a child grow up with a severe disability. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.